Do you think your dad was fighting to protect both of you, or just him and his product? Did you have nice relationship with your father? You know, usually parents try to protect their children no matter the cost, even their own life. I hope you understand my question. I'll try to explain it better if you don't understand it. He was protecting me 100,000%. Think Hunter stumbles upon a pissed-off mother grizzly stepping on one of her cubs in the process. That's how he reacted. Straight up bonsai charge full of bloodlust.
I'm the son of a drug dealer, who was killed right next to me. Ask me anything. When I was 12, my dad and I were walking up to our home after a day of hanging out. Suddenly 2 masked men, one with a Glock, appeared in front of us. Though the confrontation lasted only seconds, it seemed to happen in slow motion. The gunman approached quickly, however his timing was off slightly. The goal was to walk us into the house, a popular home invasion technique used to ambush the targets as they unlock and open their door. However, my dad hadn't opened nor unlocked the door. Thinking back, he may have baited them into charging by touching the door, because as soon as the perp got close he straight up bonsai charged him, punching him to the ground as the report from the muzzle feet away from my face, centimeters away from my dad, rang out abruptly. My dad basically ran through him. The second guy, who was hanging back, waiting for the door to open, took off running towards the getaway car parked at the end of the street, my dad behind him, still bonsai charging. The gunman, seeming just as confused as I was, got off the ground and ran towards the car also. After the car sped off, it was quiet again. I will never forget how creepy that silence after combat was. I stood there for what seemed like an hour. It was probably just a few minutes, in the exact same spot on our lawn, waiting for my dad to come back and give me the all clear. That never happened. I decided I had to look for him. In front of me was a residential street, the left side was lit by the creepies orange streetlights, and the right side was completely dark. Pitch black. The getaway car, my dad and the 2 perps all went left, but for some reason, probably scared to find what I knew I would find, I went right. Into the pitch black. The Heelys, shoes with skates in the sole, I was wearing at the time were the only sound I heard click-clacking through the darkness. Eventually, I heard a voice call out to me. It was 2 guys who knew my dad. I told them what happened and asked them to call my uncle. We then walked back towards the house where I saw 2 women looking horrified towards the ground, talking on the phone. I knew what it was they were looking at. My dad. When the police and ambulance arrived, they immediately began questioning me, as well as preparing to load my dad into the ambulance. However, when they found a 1/4 of an ounce of cocaine in his pockets, they put him back down on the ground, and really showed no interest in trying to save him emo. Eventually, 15 to 30 minutes later, the ambulance leaves, and I am taken by the police. If you've ever seen First 48, I was basically treated like a murder suspect, and as I was a kid, they treated me like, or assumed I was stupid. The best examples of this were when the sergeant came in to tell the less than enthusiastic rookie cop who was interviewing me that the victim was DOA. Either he assumed I was too stupid to know what that meant, or he genuinely didn't give a fuck. Either way, I sat there for 12 hours in that cold-ass police station answering their dumbass questions with the knowledge my dad was dead, and they wouldn't even let me contact my family. For clarification, I understand that they have a procedure to follow, but when I tell them 420 times that the weapon used was a Glock, compact model, probably a 19, and the response is for the investigator to pull out his S&W .357 and say, "Are you sure? Was it a gun like this or more like his?" comparing his revolver to the semi-auto his partner was carrying. Honestly, after hearing DOA, I was completely numb. I had told them all the information about what happened within the first 30 minutes. So for the next 11.5 hours I sat there, just wanting to go home, get in the bed. I had been up for over 24 hours by this point, and hopefully wake up to realize this was just a fucked up dream. Instead, when they finally dropped me off at my grandma's house the next morning, I had to relieve everything for my interview with the shooters hell-bent on revenge. The most awkward part was trying to act surprised that my dad was dead when my uncle pulled me to the back to tell me. I couldn't tell him that I had already known for 12 hours, and I was still wrestling with the fact that I knew this would happen the entire summer, insanely strong precognition that I tried to block out. For clarification, I was born and raised in the South, However, my parents were together on the West Coast before my mom moved down south after my dad killed a guy in self-defense in front of his mom's house. My mom's mother freaked and moved the fuck out of Dodge. They settled in the south where we have lots of family, and 8 months or so later I was born. Every summer since I was about 6 or 7, I flew out to spend a summer with my dad. It was honestly the highlight of every year. It was like going to a different world. My dad was very low-key and kept things as hidden as possible from everybody who wasn't directly involved, but being a perceptive kid I figured out what was going on, eventually. I'm not sure when he figured out I knew, but I do remember having at least a couple awkward summers where I knew, and I felt like he knew I knew, but he still did things to hide it from me, which I really respect. The funniest example of this was when we had a heat wave and it was literally 120 degrees outside, but he demanded I go outside to play. Nobody was outside and the heat was unbearable. I just wanted to go inside and play Xbox in the AC. I retreated to the porch and happened to glance through the window. The shutters were cracked slightly, and I saw my dad breaking down a brick of Coke, literally a whole brick on the table. I sat there, on one hand, appreciating the effort to keep me away from that life, but honestly, I never had the slightest interest in it anyway, and I was about to have a fucking heat stroke. Honestly, the whole situation rocked my whole outlook on life. The strategy to dealing with the trauma was to keep me busy, so over the next month I attended 3 camps. Before going to band camp, I was on a drumline, and then starting high school shortly after. Basically I was on autopilot floating through life, and when I picked my head up and looked around I was in my 20s working a job I couldn't see myself at long term, up to my eyes in student loan debt for a degree that was basically worthless in reality, and just overall down about life. I wasn't suicidal, but I didn't care about living either. One day things came to a head and I quit, took a trip to Costa Rica to clear my mind, came back and ended up becoming a contractor over in Iraq. I returned to the States in 2018 and have been trying to figure it out ever since. The difference is this time I am actively taking control over my healing process, and charting a course I believe will lead me to success. I'm not sure if anyone will even read this, but sharing this with the world has been extremely cathartic for me, so I would like to thank the Reddit community for the opportunity to share this story I've kept inside for so many years.
Thanks for reading. No, the gunman was taken by surprise, meaning he wasn't there for the kill but for the robbery. Had they got what they wanted, I'm not sure what would have happened. They were wearing bandanas over their face. If they weren't, this meant no witnesses.
What would have happened? They were wearing bandanas over their face. If they weren't, this meant no witnesses.
Damn, that's heavy. I'm truly sorry for your loss. I found out in my early 20s my dad was a major drug dealer and trafficker for all of his 20s and 30s. He had me when he was like 42 or 43. My whole life he ran a construction supply store. Kids my age of the parents that knew my dad during that time would always tell me stuff like, "Oh you/Joe mama llama, you don't even know what your dad used to do." Or "You can pay for our dinner because your dad's definitely still got money lying around." Finally talked to him about it after college. Told me some wild stories. Fortunately none of them ever resulted in loss of life. I found out I was born almost 9 months exactly after the DEA's case against my dad and his partners fell through. I also discovered that I was named after the attorney that successfully defended my dad from federal drug charges/prison time. My mom knew everything except that last fact until I did. She thought my name came from the Bible. We both now know that is definitely not the case. Curious, how has your dad's background affected you? When he was still alive, did you know what he did? Has his death or choice to sell drugs changed the way you look at crime or drug use? Your story was incredible, BTW. I've never met another person who had a parent do what ours did, so this is super revealing to me.
Hey man, glad to hear your dad made it out of the dead end game and find another way to support the family. Also amazing story about how you were named. That's some real shit lol. I'm sure my dad wanted the same thing, but there were so many people depending on him within the drug game it would have stepped on a lot of toes to say the least. I feel like he felt trapped in it, and was tired of it. I've chosen to turn his background as a sort of positive, though it might sound crazy. You hear a lot of documentaries mention that big-time drug dealers are like CEOs of a corporation and given the opportunity could build develop and lead a Fortune 500 company, etc. I'm looking to use the unique perspective gained by what I saw during that time to become successful in the light.
At the age of 12, how did you recognize the weapon as a Glock, specifically a 19, especially in the dark? Why was your father left on the ground after finding drugs on his person? How long ago did this happen? Favorite kind of cheese?
If you grew up in China, you'd probably speak Mandarin. In America's darkest areas, 12-year-olds are killing with Glocks. It'd be more surprising to find a 12-year-old who couldn't simply identify one. If a 12-year-old was born into a family of pilots, would you be surprised or skeptical that he could identify a 737 or 747 with one glance? You have to understand that there is a mental sickness that runs deep in the streets. The common mindset you find there is the only way to have any success is to become a pro athlete or an entertainer, most commonly rapper. If you can't make it in these fields, most take to the streets and lose 99.99% of the time. I was lucky enough to be raised outside of that environment, which gave me a much different perspective and outlook going into that environment every summer. Thank you for your question.
I'm sorry you went through this. I lost my mom to murder when I was 14. I know it's not unheard of, and I've met a couple people who have lost parents this way, but not very many. Years later, and it's harder to tell people because of the awkward "I'm so sorry" response than the hurt and pain of it. It's a unique experience, but for me it's normal. I don't really have many questions, except, what are you up to now? What's been your journey since? How would your life be different if this hadn't happened? Thanks for sharing.
I know exactly what you mean. Sorry you went through what you went through too. The biggest reason I hardly ever talk about it, actually probably the only reason, is because of how others react. All they can offer is sympathy unless they've dealt with something similar, and that's never what I'm looking for, so what's the point, right? I feel like putting my story out there and letting those who know my pain or resonate with some part of it is the best way to talk with people who get it. Right now I'm studying to get my real estate license. I'm trying to transition out of the restaurant industry, which sucks because my degree is in culinary management and the student debt is more than a little bit. I've inherited my dad's entrepreneurial spirit, and I'm determined to become a success as a self-made man like he did, only legally because I know that's what he wanted for me. If all this never happened, in reality it probably would have happened in a similar yet different way. Maybe I wouldn't have been there, maybe I would have been back down south and found out over the phone instead. If he survived and never went to prison, I imagine becoming successful enough myself legally that I could retire both of my parents.
If you had the chance to have a conversation with the gunman, what would you ask him? Also, if your dad were to survive the attack, do you think things would have been different between you and your father, knowing that he couldn't hide the drugs from you anymore?
Honestly, I never really harbored much, if any, hatred or anger towards the gunman. If anything, I was sad for him. Nobody would try that unless they were really desperate. This wasn't a small-time job, and they obviously were green. All they got for that was a murder investigation they didn't want. It's the game, everybody knows the rules and the risks. Had he survived, he would have went to prison for a very long time, which would restrict us a lot, but of course I would be able to talk to him and visit him as much as possible, which would be great. But it seems selfish to wish he'd survived to rot in a cell, you know? We all got to go. Life expectancy in that life, especially in the 80s when they grew up, was under 18 for the ones who got started young. That's why I laughed when a few people questioned my ability to identify a Glock in the heat of battle. It just shows how blind to what goes on in the less desirable parts of the country the majority of Americans are. The sad reality is there are a number of 12-year-olds with walking around these neighborhoods who have taken lives and are killed themselves. Some write them off as savages, but can we honestly say they would turn out the same way, given some of the opportunities we had growing up?
Where did this all take place?
Cali, Bay Area.
Once again you made it to the end. I'm happy finally my dream comes true. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a like. See you on the next video.